Cominciamo forse, buon pomeriggio, good afternoon everyone, buon pomeriggio a tutte e a tutti. Iniziamo il nostro seminario in italiano e poi passeremo alla lingua inglese per tracciare una linea di continuità con i seminari precedenti nell'ambito di questa clinica. Come sapete dal programma si tratta dell'ultimo appuntamento nel quale abbiamo pensato di invitare due ospiti stranieri che potessero portarci un punto di vista diverso dagli altri, un punto di vista che cerchi di tenere però insieme il percorso fatto. So, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to introduce this seminar with just a few words. Just to thanks Charles Szymanski from University Vytautas, Lithuania, and Lukas Stuklin from Invetos. They are both experts on the field of social impact bond, and we are now focusing on how to build up a occupational social bond or occupational social impact bond. I just would like to welcome Lucas and Charles, and I now give the floor to Chiara for a short introduction to the seminar. Chiara, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Riccardo. Parlo in italiano solo per ricordarvi come sempre le questioni, diciamo così, un po' più tecniche, quindi il fatto che registriamo come sempre questa lezione e come sempre poi la caricheremo sulla piattaforma Moodle di modo tale che possiate averne poi accesso. E quindi anche per le questioni di privacy vi ricordo che potete fare le domande attraverso la chat, potrete farle anche in italiano se volete, io posso tradurle, e quindi potete fare domande attraverso la chat oppure parlare direttamente al microfono e con la webcam. Lucas Stuklin in realtà parla anche un po' di italiano, quindi forse se fate delle domande in modo diciamo così semplice, un po' lentamente, forse riesce anche a capirvi, se no potete parlare in inglese. So I don't want to take too much time. I would like to give the floor to Charles Szymanski to start our lessons for today. So Charles, I leave the floor to you, and thank you very much again for being here.
Okay, thank you, Chiara, I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Let me get the slides going. Okay. Let me first say, as I said, kind of in the pre-introduction, it's really a pleasure to be a part of this seminar and also to see Riccardo, Chiara. Again, Camelia, I have a great sympathy for Trento, and if you can't be there in person, I guess we could at least be here virtually. So my soul is with you, my spirit is with you today. My topic today is from really a trade union perspective of social impact bonds and some alternatives maybe to social impact bonds. My background in the United States was for a long time with labor unions, as counsel to labor unions, training labor unions. So that's where I'm coming from, but I'll try to give as balanced approach as I can. So the title of the presentation is Trade Unionism versus Neoliberalism, Different Paths to Impact Investing in the US. First, I'm going to present some trade union models of impact investing, and then we'll switch to social impact bonds, and then finally try to have a conclusion as to which path or both paths might have the most promise in the US. Well, when we talk about impact investing, even the very word of it, impact, it means you should be able to change something, to do something. And if we talk about trade unions and how could they make an impact on investing in social programs or homelessness or job retraining, how could they do that? You know, as we all know, maybe Italy is a little bit better and Switzerland is in better shape in terms of how unions are. But in the United States, they're having a difficult time. You know, if we do a graph, it's going down. So what power could they possibly have in impact investing? And the answer really is pension funds. In the US, even though unions have declined, they still have, you know, huge multi-billion dollar pension funds from the past. So these are retirees, and huge amounts of money are there. And so the question is, can unions do anything with these pension funds, some of which have been collectively bargained, to do some impact investing, to influence society in a positive way through using that money? There are two types of pension funds in the US. I mean, there's private pension funds and public pension funds, and we'll get to the difference and why that might make a difference in a second. But aside from that difference, there's also two types of pension mechanisms. Defined contribution, that's becoming most popular today. You put a certain amount of money in, or the employer does, or both of you do, and it's invested, and whatever happens to it, hopefully the investment will work. You get that money when you retire. Defined benefit is something different. It's basically you get half of your salary, you get 3/4 of your salary. You get a certain benefit that's defined at the end. You know, as an employee, you could expect a specific amount when you retire. There are also union versus non-union pension funds, right? So some are controlled partially by unions and some are completely controlled by employers. Union pension funds tend to be this defined benefit where the employees are expecting a certain amount when they retire. Before 1947, there were no restrictions on union pension funds. Unions controlled them and they could basically do what they wanted with the money. And they used this money for, you know, not only for guaranteeing people's retirement, but for other social reasons, to help members, to help the community. After 1947, there was the Taft-Hartley amendments to the National Labor Relations Act, and this restricted the union's power over these huge pension funds. And after 1947, collectively bargained pension funds have to be half controlled by employers and half by unions. So they have a board, and half of the members on the board have to be employer representatives, half have to be unions. I should say, even with this restriction, unions tend to have more control than the employers. Why is that? Usually it tends to be one union and many different employers. So it could be the United Mine Workers, and they have 100 mining companies. And if you have one union and multiple employers, even though there's equal representatives on the board, the union tends to dominate these funds and could have some control on how the money is used. So now you have a little bit of background about this pension money and you know how the unions might do something with it. We talk about impact investing, negative and positive. You know, negative impact investing is basically you screen out undesirable investments, you know, tobacco, nuclear power, defense, for some countries that have some difficult human rights records. You know, and that's in a sense an easier thing to do. You just say, we don't want these types of investments, we're going to do something else. And then positive, that's actually making a difference in the community, building low-income housing, maybe for workers. That's a little bit more complex, but that would also be a form of impact investing. We see ESG and socially responsible investing, some terminology below the slide. So these are the types of impact investing, and what could unions do? Well, we know that they control some money, a lot of money, but there is a federal law in the United States called ERISA, the Employment Retirement Income Security Act, that basically puts some fiduciary duties on unions. So they can't use it for whatever purposes they want. They have to use it for the exclusive benefit of the workers. It's kind of like a trust law model. The pension fund is holding this money in trust for the workers, so they can be sure they can get something at a later time. This is the exclusive benefit rule, and it should be only used for the employees. So if it's only used for the employees, well, how could you invest in housing? How could you invest in something that might create new jobs that would benefit workers or benefit the community? That's a little bit difficult. The general rule has been if it's an equal, if it's an investment with an equal return, something that's socially responsible, something that's not, but both have the same expected return, you can choose the socially responsible investment. That's possible. Now, the Department of Labor, which kind of administers this pension law, ERISA, has made it a little bit more complicated, and this is purely political. In the end of the George Bush era, they put out a kind of a rule, the Department of Labor, that said basically what I just said. You can make social investments if the return is equal to other investments, but they said you have to have documentary proof, and you really have to make sure that the social investment it will have an equal return. This scared a lot of people because they said, well, maybe we can't guarantee that. Maybe the other investment was going to be a little bit better. And so maybe some social investing and impact investing declined. Under President Obama, they reversed that. They said, yeah, no, you could look at social impacts. That could be part of it. We encourage it. Even though, again, you can't do it at the expense of the employees, they kind of pushed it the other way. And in 2020, this year, under President Trump, although he's gone, well, we'll see what happens, but I think he's gone soon. But his Department of Labor put out a rule basically going back saying you have to be very careful about this. The main concern has to be employees, not social benefits. So there are some restrictions that kind of tie the union's hands there because, again, there should be money for the employees at the end of the tunnel. They have to make sure really that the socially responsible investment will have approximately an equal return. I think now we have a Democratic administration, these will be encouraged a little bit more. Public pension funds are not covered by this federal pension law, so they have a little bit more flexibility. In California, investments from these pension funds may be for the public good, and the main public employee pension fund is really active in environmental investing and green investing. So they have more flexibility, I think, in the public sector. In Ohio, public employee investments in minority or female-owned firms, that's okay. That's an appropriate investment as well. So there are some possibilities with public pension funds and union pension funds to do some social investing. They're a little bit limited by this fiduciary responsibility that the main goal has to make sure that the employees have something for their retirement. A really quick word about another aspect of trade unionism and impact investing, just quickly about apprenticeship programs, especially in the construction industry. Unions have joint apprenticeship programs with employer organizations to train plumbers, pipe fitters, construction workers. These are allowed under the National Labor Relations Act, and the union then operates as a hiring hall. Once the apprentice has been trained to be a plumber, they go to the union hall and say, I'd like a job. The employer may say, yeah, we have a 2-month project building a building, we need plumbers. The union sends this person there, they're covered by a collective bargaining agreement, and it's run that way. We'll come back to these union apprenticeship programs at the end after we talked about the social impact bond model and some worker retraining possibilities. But unions do have a capacity to do that, although it's really mostly in the building trades. All right, what are the relative merits of this? I don't like to quote a Clint Eastwood movie, but that's my American background. The good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that workers' organizations control investment priorities, and so we have a bottom-up approach. It's not people from the top, it's not governments, it's not corporations, but worker organizations decide this, and they might be better able to allocate investments that might actually help people at the bottom. And the social value of unions, if we talk about the community aspect of unions, the social aspect, not just employment, but if you are a union member, you tend to have a job, reasonable income. If you're a former prisoner, if you had problems with addiction or homelessness, you're part of this larger union community, and that should also have a social benefit for you. The bad is kind of that, as we mentioned, these negative social impacts, where we don't invest in the particular company. That's not as helpful as a positive social investing, where you're building a building or you're creating jobs. You're just kind of screening out some companies, and that doesn't quite have as much impact as we would like. Accessibility too, I would say. We talked about apprenticeship. I'm not so sure the union's first concern is the homeless. They're kind of concerned for their members or people who are like their members in their same category. And I'm not so sure that the unions are really that always interested in the broader public good. That's just an overview about from the labor law side about trade unions and what they could do with with social impact investing. Let's just quickly look, well, not so quickly, but look at the other approach, social impact bonds. And in the American kind of literature, it would be called pay for success contracts. And the idea is that this is really not a bond. It's really more of a contractual instrument. It's not a financial instrument. It's a contract that you're rewarded if you meet certain benchmarks or goals. The problem is that the government lacks money for social services. But if these services aren't provided, then the government even loses more money. If people are locked up in prison, if they can't, get jobs, if they can't fit back into the community, it's hugely expensive to have these beds for them in the public prisons, and so their costs increase. So it's kind of a catch-22. What's the solution? Well, from an American perspective, this is great. Capitalism to the rescue, private investment, win-win. Private investors, they've got lots of money. Invest in social programs, help people. If the investment turns out well and the problem is solved, they get a reward. They get a good return on their investment. If it doesn't work out, it's like any investment, and the government doesn't lose, but the investor loses. Let's just look at it a little bit more, more specifically or more in detail. What's the model of this? The private investor identifies some type of social welfare program. It could be getting prisoners, to fit back into the community and not going back to prison, getting people jobs. One program we'll talk about very quickly is about educational, to keep kids out of special education programs that are very expensive. Maybe there's a solution for them earlier so they don't wind up in a more expensive educational program. And this is managed by an intermediary organization. Some organization connects the investor and the government, puts this together, we get an NGO involved, we'll talk about that in a second, and makes this work. If the benchmarks are met, the investor gets a return or profit. Theoretically, this is financed by government savings. We take the prisoner model. If the people are not, when they're released from prison, if they commit more crimes and go back, that's a huge cost to society. And if the government can keep these people out of prison and productive members of society, they're going to have some cost savings. So this is where the win-win comes in. If not, if it doesn't work, the investor loses money. What are the actors in an American SIB? The population, the underserved population, homeless, ill people in hospitals, people who don't have sufficient job training. So some underprivileged group we're looking at, a government entity that has to be involved, investors, NGOs or social service providers. I mentioned about this intermediary organization, basically that manages the project and puts the parties together, and a program evaluator. In the literature, it suggests the Americans are a little bit, they divide the evaluation part into two parts. The independent review is the benchmark met, are the goals met, and ongoing evaluation and monitoring. And these sometimes are done by two different evaluators. That's supposed to be an Americanism. Here's some structures of SIBs in the US. I don't know if I'm going to spend too much time, just going through this, but you could see it there. I mean, you look at whether this is feasible, what's the time frame. This is from the investor's perspective. Can the NGO achieve the outcomes, good political conditions, implement it, and then see if the benchmarks are met. If they are met, you get a return. If not, you could lose some money. And the form of the contract, we have it on the slide as well. Again, there's an oversight reporting provision in the contract. The trend seems to be in the US to have the investor more involved with that, to have an observer or even a representative on the oversight board to see if the benchmark is being met. What's the framework from an investment point of view? Well, we could look at this as a chart, kind of untested, innovative, existing social welfare program, mixed results, existing social welfare program, good results. And then there's a risk reward. right? So theoretically, how this should work, like with any investment, if you go to a untested, innovative social program, well, it may not work. The chances are that there may be a problem with that. But if it does work, you should get a higher percentage return on your investment. The safest investment will be where? The bottom, right? Existing social welfare program, good results, something that already works, some kind of program that works, and that's safe. You'll get a return because we've seen government is working on that. Some risk management things to take into account would be disbursement of investments in installments and early termination. So if you have a $10 million investment, you don't have to wait to the end and lose everything. You could see in a year or two, this is not working, and there could be a provision in the contract to terminate that. Okay. Sometimes we also see some charities guarantee also part of the investment as well. But just looking at this chart, this is rather important. Really what I've seen is the safer investment tends to be just to replace an existing government program that more or less works. That's the safest investment. We would like to move them more into untested and innovative things to encourage innovation, but so far that hasn't happened. It may have happened in Europe, and you may have done a much better job of it here, but looking at this chart, I think it's rather important. What's the legal framework for these things? The legal framework is there's a new federal law, again, interestingly under President Trump, February 2018, the Social Impact Partnerships to Pay for Results Act. You know, it's a tongue twister. Some legislation is like that. That basically is a grant mechanism, and it first allocated $100 million to these SIBs. But this is, again, an indication that the Democrats who are on the left and the Republicans on the right, even Trump, who's kind of, you know, an exceptional person, they both feel good about this. Obama liked this, Trump liked it. And then we see some examples on state and local laws that also encourage the social impact bonds or something similar, these pay for success contracts. Basically what they do is they allow a feasibility study. Can it work? They provide funding, and maybe sometimes there's some risk management for the investor to make sure the investor doesn't quite lose everything, to encourage the investor to put some money into these projects. These are some of the states that have enacted laws with it. What are some examples in the United States? You know, now we've talked about the theory and the structure. What does it look like? Well, I would say it's a slow start, but it could be big. The Rockefeller Foundation says it could be $1 billion in the midterm, so not the short term, but maybe 5-10 years out, invested in these things. The surveys that have been done so far, we look from 2012 to 2017, there were 18 examples, and half of them involve criminal justice and housing and homelessness. And some commentators have said the goal is to empty beds. So to empty out the hospitals, empty the homeless shelters, empty the prisons. These people don't go back there if you're sick or you're homeless or you're in prison. If they keep these beds empty, that's a huge cost savings. There are 34 total investors and 12 repeat investors, which might be a little bit interesting, but I think some investors are developing some expertise in this. Some examples, as I promised, Chiara, you know, we gave an overview, but we have to give some substance to the theory, just to, you know, how do these things work? The first one in the US was Rikers Island. You know, this is very American, isn't it? You know, it seems like a, you know, welcome. It seems like a tourist poster or something, but actually it's a notorious prison. You know, really some violent people are in here, not a pleasant place, but so don't be deceived by this poster. Well, what happened? They had a goal to, you know, people who were young offenders, 16 to 18-year-old males, they were going in and out of prisons. And the idea was, well, we got to do something to stop that because it's really costing a lot, society a lot, and it's costing New York a lot of money. So this is the first one in the US. Goldman Sachs, a huge, you know, investment firm, they put 9.6 million in, and the NGO that was running the project basically, if they hit certain benchmarks, if they caused a 10 to 20% reduction in recidivism for 3,000 under 18 male prisoners, then there could be a bonus or return of over $2 million. And what is the 10 to 20% reduction? That's versus the control group. What was happening? How many people were going back to the prisons? So if Goldman Sachs could beat that with their NGO by 10 to 20%, they can get a $2 million return. Now, again, sometimes with investors, right, theoretically, they could lose everything. Bloomberg put up 7.2 million as a guarantee. So Goldman Sachs was never going to lose more than 2.4 million because the foundation guaranteed a large portion of that loan. This didn't work. It was too tough of a project and it failed after 3 years. But generally, I think the sense in the US was it was kind of positive because they tried it. Okay, it didn't work this time, but we could do better, maybe in some other different types of projects. Another different type of project, or SIB, was in the Salt Lake City pre-kindergarten children. And the idea was that, again, if an investor could get the right NGO and do better than government and help these pre-kindergarten kids, encourage them and give them a better education before they get to kindergarten, then the problematic children wouldn't end up in special education classes. In special education classes, you have a lot of problems. You can't be put with a normal group, and it's quite expensive to run. So the idea was, hey, maybe an outside investor could come up with a better solution. And so again, in this one, it was 6.8 million. Goldman Sachs was involved again. This was a success in the sense that of 104 kids that were kind of assigned to Goldman, I mean, not to Goldman, but to their NGO that tried to help them, only one needed special education. And they got a 5% return on the investment, which was fairly reasonable for the money that they put in. I should say, even more than the 5% investment, Goldman Sachs then raised another 150 million in a special social investment fund. So this was really good publicity for them that they were able to succeed on it. I don't have enough time to explain kind of the darker side to this, but there was some allegation that this was manipulated a little bit. In other words, that Salt Lake City gave them good kids to begin with. The experts said it's a 99% success rate is impossible, no matter how much money you throw at them. Some of the kids are going to need special education. So there was some allegations that these kids really didn't have a lot of problems to begin with. And the SIB really didn't do anything. That's an allegation. That was like a New York Times article afterwards. But I think generally this has been viewed as a success. A new one, maybe especially relevant to this course and to us, is a worker training program. And this is from my home city of Philadelphia. We could see in the picture, the biggest building on at least my right, looking at it, is the Comcast building. Comcast is like a huge internet service provider, cable communications company. And this is a new program that was launched this year. It goes under this kind of contract theory for success. 75 local employees will be trained by an organization called Philadelphia Works for 3 years. And they're training them specifically for Comcast to hold specific types of jobs at this employer. If the training is successful, again, these benchmarks are met, then Comcast pays for part of the training. These funds then are used for future trainings. So the idea was that normally this is just done through government grants or NGOs do the training anyway. What they were happy about this, pay for success model was that, all right, if this works out, these people get jobs at Comcast, they hold these jobs, they retain them. Comcast will pay for part of their training. That money will go into a training fund and it will train employees for different employers and different pay for success contracts. This has just started, so I can't tell you how successful it is, but this is a model involving worker retraining or training that has just gotten underway. I think we've already kind of indicated, in the presentation about the good and the bad. The positives on paper look really good. The government has no money. Private investors have a lot of money. If they could make money by doing something good, this is perfect for everybody. And maybe there's even some better quality control. I think the main disadvantage is privatization. So, and we, as labor law students and labor lawyers and labor law professors, privatization does impact unions, it does impact the workplace, and it could impact it negatively. So, and also if you have different kind of a social perspective, you could say private firms shouldn't be doing this. The government should be providing social services, and you should improve what the government does, not bring out private parties. So I think the main disadvantage has been privatization. As I kind of alluded to or indicated, unions in the US are generally against the SIB or, pay for success contract model. One of the reasons they're especially against it is that it accelerates the decline of unions. In the private sector, unions are being completely smashed, but in the public sector, it's relatively stable. There's some more job protections in the public sector in the United States that make it easier for them to form and join and maintain union membership. So if you privatize these public jobs that were heavily unionized, they'll probably switch to non-union. And so unions are quite against this. This is a kind of a chart from the American Public Service Worker Union, the American Federation of State and County and Municipal Employees. And, we don't have to go through it, but basically you see what they're trying to say, the SIBs have all the middlemen or middle people, right? And all the money is going to the intermediaries and the consultants and the investors, and only a small part goes to the service recipients. You could take a look at this chart. I think this is borrowed from a Canadian union, actually, but the American unions thought this is a good way to illustrate it. We don't have time to go through it, but you could see it's just showing it's very complicated and not all the money goes where it should be, as opposed to government directly providing the service to the service recipients. And here's a resolution that this labor union did, and this is 2014 when the SIBs were beginning. You could read this and you could see that, the hostility the labor unions have towards this. Social impact bonds, sometimes called pay for success, are the latest financing gimmick, like scheme or, plot to, take away public goods and replace it with Wall Street money. So you could get a sense of how unions feel about that. So basically to conclude, what I tried to give you an overview is, from a labor union perspective, that's my perspective. What could labor unions do? There's some possibilities with social investing and impact investing with pension funds, a little bit more flexibility with these public sector pension funds. But, there are limitations because the main idea of a pension is not social investing, it's to have these people have a retirement. So then we move to SIBs, and I think, on the surface, it looks good. I think theoretically, it could be win-win. It seems like something very adapted to the, American mentality. But one of the main downsides from a labor law perspective would be the privatization model and the, kind of the neoliberal model and how it may affect labor unions. And you could see some negativity from one of the larger public sector labor unions. All right, Kara, I think I hope I'm on time relatively or a little bit over, but that's about it.
No, you are perfect on time. Thank you very much, Charles. So are there maybe any questions from the students on this topic, taking into considerations the attitude of the trade unions in the US towards these instruments? We also have to take into account the fact that in the US, the trade unions are losing their power from a lot of time, whereas in Italy we do not have the same picture. But as you can see, it's interesting to know that one of the actors of welfare, because trade unions are also an actor of welfare system in the US, are against this model. That means that probably trade unions in Italy also will be against this model. We do not know yet because these instruments are very new. They haven't been introduced in Italy yet. But the issue that we have already talked about last week, that is the issue of the privatization of welfare, is on the table. This is probably, so it is not a technical problem, it's more a cultural problem. We do not want to give away public good, as Charles has said. So are there any questions maybe on the cases that we have talked about?
Yeah, if possible, I wanted to ask something, if possible.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if from the workers' point of view, as we said, union trades use pension funds. They invest pension funds in social, not social, to impact the society, so for social reasons. And what I wanted to ask is, what is the point of view of the workers that see their pension fund invested in other things other than their own pension, if possible?
Yeah, Rebecca, that's a great question. You know, and I would say, you know, unfortunately in the American labor movement, there's kind of a split. I would say half of the workers that are in unions are very dedicated, like, you know, the militant union members. And I think that they would be in favor, and they often tend to be in the union leadership, right? So the leadership tends to be more to the left in the labor unions. And they would be for that, you know, in other words, yeah, well, maybe the return isn't as good, but we're creating a social impact. We're helping jobs for the community. This is great. I would say the other half, you know, nowadays with computer, you're checking your pension fund, you know, you're checking your investments. No, I want to make sure that I have the most amount of money possible. I don't care about the homeless. I don't care about, you know, prisoners. I care about myself. So I think it's difficult to say, you know, uniformly. But in the US, I would say it's a split. The activist half of the labor union membership would probably be okay with this, and that means the leadership. But then about the other half, and these would be Trump voters as well, right? I mean, you know, politically, the American labor movement isn't like 100% in one direction. The other half would be like, hey, you know, this is my money. Most important is me and my family, and I have to do, you know, absolutely sure that what was promised will be there for me. But that's a really good question. So I would say the answer is
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, because as you may remember from the last lesson that we had some empirical research here in Italy, especially here in Trentino, that said the opposite of what Charles has said. The opposite was that we have some citizens, most of the citizens, that are keen to invest in social tools. And why is that? Because they do care about homelessness. They do not care not only about their family, about I want to maximize my profit. They do also care about the others people. And why is this important? This is important to have research on the state, because this tells us two things. First of all, that the success of the social impact bond depends strictly on the state or on the region where you create it, because you have to have someone that is actually interested in these kind of instruments. And therefore you have to have research before in order to test whether there is an interesting, whether there might be investors willing to put their monies in these investors. And this also surprised me a bit to hear that, Charles, because I thought actually that these kind of instruments would perfectly work for pension funds, because I thought in my mind, so this is my question, I thought that somehow the pension funds had to be have to have a social approach to their financing methods. I didn't think that anything counted, that they could actually invest on, I don't know, arms or anything else, but they should provide to their workers, they should have to demonstrate to their workers that they are willing to put monies also on social investments.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kara. I would say just two things. One is about the structure of these Taft-Hartley funds. So remember, they're half employer. They're, you know, even though the unions tend to dominate, but the employers have some influence. So it's not that the unions could do whatever they want. Generally, they can, but there's some limitations, right? They tend to be more conservative about that. And so the other issue I would say we didn't go into, but this law on fiduciary responsibility of pension funds and ERISA, that has huge penalties if you make a bad investment. And so that's why I was mentioning these Department of Labor regulations between Obama and Trump. Obama and the Democrats would encourage more social investing, And the Republicans would say, no, you only have to look at returns. You have to be very, very careful. And so I think that that makes the pension funds more conservative. So if they make the wrong choice, doing socially responsible investing, they could have huge liabilities under this law legally. And I think that that also makes them a little bit more conservative. I think just to finish up, the sweet spot, I think that, the California, for example, public employees pension fund is hit. And I know this is something you're interested in, and Ricardo as well, about the idea of sustainable development in labor law. And in the environment, I think it's easier to conceptualize. Let's invest in Tesla because it's electric, that's good for the environment, and it's a good investment, right? It has a higher market capitalization than the old auto companies. That's great for everybody, and you're going green, and it's something sustainable for the future. And I think maybe the job of academics, perhaps in some way, is to connect more that labor law is also, or labor issues are also part of sustainable development. If we have huge unemployment, poor jobs, homelessness, higher rates of incarceration, that's not good for society. That's not good for workers. That's not sustainable either. So I think the environmental connection investors have made, and now if they could make it with things that impact workers and impact society, that's part of sustainable development as well.
Are there maybe any other questions to add to Charles?
It was all perfectly clear, Kira,
I think so. Maybe some on the examples, were they all clear? Because as you can see, we have had some failure also. The very first example was a failure, actually. So they didn't meet the goals. Others instead were successful. So there might be some questions on that. Or is it everything clear? If it's clear, we can move to the other speech and then maybe come back afterwards with other questions if there are any. So we now move from the US to Europe. We actually moved to Switzerland, and we are going to talk about a specific SIB, SIB, that was constructed by also by Lucas, right? By his company, the Investors AG, along with Caritas and along with Focus Bern. So the experience is close to ours because it's, as I said, in Switzerland, in Bern. And the goal was to relocate and to ease the access of refugees and immigrants into the labor market. As you remember from the last week, if I remember correctly, we talked about some experiences that we had here in Italy of cooperatives that tried to ease the access to the market to this kind of labors, to the immigrants and refugees. But we also said that one of the huge problems that they face was the lack of money. So this is also an interesting point of view because Lucas is going to talk us about these specific experience. So I give the floor to you, Lucas, and thank you very much.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti e grazie all'Università di Trento per darmi questa opportunità di presentare il nostro Social Impact Bond oggi. Il nostro bond è stato il primo di questo genere in Svizzera e anche uno dei primi in Europa continentale, penso. Abbiamo iniziato il bond nel 2015 e quest'anno siamo arrivati alla fine del progetto. Dunque è un buon momento per presentare il nostro bond e i dati della ricerca che ha accompagnato il progetto. Vi prego di scusarmi se posso fare solo questa introduzione in italiano e il resto in inglese, ma il soggetto di oggi è abbastanza tecnico e purtroppo non sono capace di presentarlo in italiano. And for this reason I will switch to English. which is also nice, but I think your language is very beautiful. Let me share my screen with the slides. Can you see them? Yes. So it was really interesting to listen to the overview given by Charles. What I'm presenting you today is an actual social impact bond that is ending, as I just said, and that has been tested in Switzerland. Now think of the following environment, also a little bit in comparison to what Charles showed from the States. Think of a social welfare state in Switzerland that is pretty well developed, probably like in Italy. So that's my assumption about all the countries in Europe, that most welfare states are well developed. In Switzerland, beyond the cliche, you know, there's not money for everything, but the welfare state is quite well financed. But nevertheless, the welfare state is not effective. It cannot solve every problem, because not every problem can be solved with money. So we were facing here a problem, and you see it in the title. As in Italy, you are much more impacted, but also in Switzerland, we have a lot of refugees and a growing number, many of them very qualified, but we really struggle to integrate them into the labor market. And to be a little bit frank, because I represent the private sector, Evento is a financial company, and all we do is help clients to invest their money sustainably. I can also comment regarding the question we had before. I don't think if you invest sustainably, it means that you will have to lose money. It is really a question in which universe you invest. So if you invest in the stock market and you apply some exclusion criteria, you can still earn nice return for pension funds. If you go into such a thing like the social impact bond, which is something new, it gets a little bit dangerous. And the problems of the labor market, funnily or tragically, have to do, in the case of Switzerland, also with labor unions, who are mainly, that's my view, and I'm representing the private sector, so allow me to be a little bit provocative. Labor unions are mainly concerned with workers who are in the labor market, but maybe not that much concerned with how people who are outside can get into the labor market. My slides will be horribly technical. I don't have a lot of pictures, and please stay with me. The good thing is this is real. We did this, we have real data, we have real experience. What we mean with social impact bonds, and this is very important, we don't mean a model where you might lose all your money as an investor. So we mean an investment. You can lose some of your money, you can win some return, but it's not a donation. And we don't have, there is no foundation like Bloomberg in one of the examples who will pay. The state will pay back. I will explain on that. Results are measured. That's very important, as Charles said. If you don't have a benchmark, and that's a problem in Switzerland, possibly also in Italy, if you don't have data, it's very hard to measure. And then our special point in this project, we really believe that the state, the provider, Charles mentioned that the providers didn't have incentives, and the investors, they all need to be in the same boat. So we tried in our social impact bond in Berna, we tried to incentivize the provider as well. I will show that at a glance, and you can see I even tried to include a picture here to make it more emotional. So we have a problem in Switzerland. Although there is a lot of money in the social welfare state, immigrants, refugees, or they are called temporarily admitted immigrants, they wait for the final decision. So they live in, for example, in the canton is like a province in Italy, in the canton of Bern. They have a very low employment rate. 10 to 20% of them are in employment. The others are on social welfare. And the question, and this is a problem, although there is a lot of money around, it's becoming less and less in Switzerland also, but there is enough money around. The welfare state is well developed, but this problem is very persistent. So the question was, can we improve this employment rate? If not only if private investors come in, they will not change it, but if we work on the incentives and on the methodology on how to integrate refugees. That's very, very important, because you see down here, Caritas, who was the provider for us in Switzerland, a lot of the welfare work and work with immigrants is outsourced. It's not evil private companies, it's NGOs like Caritas, like other NGOs, but they are paid not on outcomes. They are paid on the number of hours they teach language courses to immigrants. They are paid by activities, not by outcomes. So we wanted to include that in the project. You see the structure down here. I will go into that in another slide, but this question was crucial here. We had a problem and we wanted to try to test new methodologies. What is or was the structure of our social impact bond? And you know, yeah, it's going to be quite technical. I can't change it. So we had a clear target group. That's very, very important. We discussed with various Swiss cantons about other target groups, because we said if we want to test the social impact bond, we need a clearly defined target group on which you can't cheat. So in Bern, we realized, you know, this is the group, temporarily admitted immigrants with the very low employment rate I told you. And the goal was to integrate them into the labor market sustainably. So not just on you know, on limited contracts, but on permanent contracts. So the criteria for measurement were pretty clear. We would define a number of participants in the program. It was set at minimum of 120 immigrants, which would be coached for 5 years. And they had to have an employment on a permanent basis with normal payment rates, and they needed to work for at least 50%. Another measurement we included was how many had terminated the contracts and how many had completed a training or a degree. And then the canton of Bern said, okay, these are the rules of the game. We devised a measurement formula, and then we didn't do that. Yes, we were the intermediary. We then searched for the investors, but the canton, the state, went to choose the service provider. So they did a request for proposal, and Caritas, which you also know in Italy, I believe, it's a church NGO, they were mandated. They are not new to the business. They work for the state already, but they were new to this approach that we followed. Yeah, so what we implemented here, and this is important to understand, and I think following on from Charles, you know, the models he showed were mostly a so-called equity model. I'm flipping back. We applied a bond model. With the bond model, I mean, and you have to follow the numbers to not to be confused by this graph. It means private investors, number one, they give a loan to the state. The state has a contract with a social institution, Caritas, and then the social institution with that money, in our case, it was 2.7 million Swiss francs, roughly 2.5 million euros. With this money, they needed to integrate as many refugees into the labor market during 5 years. So they had to solve this problem. and they had to be better than the benchmark, which is the 10 to 20%, or let's say the 20% until now, but the benchmark was set higher at 50%, had to be included in the labor market. Then you see number 4 is the measurement, very important that you properly measure. And then at the end, the investors receive some of the money back from the state and the premium. And now very important, and this was very controversial with politicians here in Switzerland, the social institution also gets a bonus or a malus. If they do well, they get a premium. If they don't do well, they have to pay back, you see this, the red 5, some of the project money. This was very, very controversial because many people thought that's introducing banking, you know, money thinking into the social, into the welfare state. That's a bond model, and I will show you later on. Investors, the most they can lose in this model is 5%. So they put in 100, and the worst outcome is the state pays them back 95. The best case is they put in 100, and if the project is very successful, they get back 105. So 5% interest for 5 years. I will explain you in a minute why this is so conservative. It's very conservative. While the equity model, I will not focus on that for a long time. This is more the US model you saw, where you can lose much more and win much more. But because maybe our countries are not as capitalistic or as neoliberal as the US, this was not politically doable. There was too much resistance against this because politicians were afraid of, you know, private investors earning a lot of money on the back of refugees. That's how they put it. And I think they forgot that if investors earn a lot of money, then a lot of refugees would have a job. But let's leave that aside. So we went for a conservative bond model. Please apologize the complexity of this slide, but you guys are all smart. So you see here, we then went to search for investors, which wasn't a big issue because the 2.7 million, that's quite limited. It was mainly private investors and charitable foundations. They had to invest through a social impact bond limited. We didn't want this structure to be that complex, but that's legal problems, legal issues in Switzerland. Then the money would go to through the state to the social institution. Now, very important, the canton of Bern, the state, put in quite some money into the scientific advisory board and the evaluation board, because they said, and we said, we want this to be monitored properly. So we cannot manipulate the figures. Caritas cannot manipulate the figures. The state cannot manipulate the figures. And this is probably the best thing about this pilot, that there is a lot of data available, and there is a separate research entity supervising this, and they were in all the steering committees. Because of course, me representing the investors, I might have an incentive to revise, as Charles said, maybe in the case of Goldman, to revise up the results, maybe to change the target group. So I think we have a good solution here, but it costs, and it's covered by the canton. So if you want to properly evaluate it, you need a foundation or the state who pays for it. And that's really a disadvantage of social impact bonds. They're complex and they're fairly costly. Yeah, I think I mentioned most of the characteristics. Again, this was very, very debated, the bonus malus system. So we said if if the project goes wrong, it means the canton of Bern still has the same number of immigrants on social welfare, has the same costs for years to come. So they will not pay back the whole sum to private investors, only 95%. If we are better than the canton has been until now with refugees, then less people will be on social welfare. The canton will save a lot of money going forward if this is sustainable. So they give investors 5%, and they also give Caritas a little bonus or a little malus. We had one big issue. That's the last point. You have seen this in other such bonds, development bonds. Usually a nice thing for the state was that if private investors pre-finance something, even if you have to pay it back after 5 years, you have 5 years. So you have the time value of money, which is nice. So you don't need the money now, you only need it in 5 years. Now, and in Italy, you understand the problem because you also have negative interests. In a negative interest environment, which Switzerland has entered 4 years ago, the state doesn't want to wait to spend the money because they have to pay negative interest rate. So they don't have this incentive anymore. They want to get rid of the money rather today than tomorrow because the interest rate or the time value of money, which is a banking term, is destroyed. That was a little bit of a challenge. What else can I say on the challenges? The database is really an issue. If you don't have comparable data, it's difficult. Yeah, then you see this point, the public statement. So that was a huge issue. Can private investors earn money and how much? How do we measure the goals? Or how did we measure the goals? I briefly went into that. We were, or Caritas was allowed to so every refugee was allowed to apply for this program, but Caritas was allowed to turn down 1/3 of the applicants with low employability. So you might ask, why is that? Isn't that cherry picking? Well, remember that the benchmark set was very high, 50% integration, not the 20 that are normal in Bern, but 50% of immigrants included in the labor market. Therefore, Caritas was allowed, and this was a decision by the state, not by us, to separate all applications into 3 groups. Low employability, this correlates strongly with language skills, medium and high employability. There was an assessment done with every applicant where they were put in one of the groups. And then you have those relative goals, and you have one absolute goal on the right, which was if people do some courses, degrees, education during their time in the workspace, this is counted positively. Then you have the success rate, and you can compare that. Now this really is a banking slide or a banker slide. Here you see the financial structure. So on the bottom left, you see the payout, so-called payout diagram for the service provider, for Caritas. So if they would have worked very badly, if they would have missed the benchmark is at 100%. So if they would have been down to 55% of the benchmark, they would have had to pay back 1.5% of the project sum. This is very, very conservative, but they would have had to pay back part of the project money. This was a revolution for NGOs in Switzerland, and not all of them wanted to apply for this because they said we don't want to be outcome measured, and we don't want to have to pay back. And on the other side, you see the maximum bonus that Caritas can achieve, where the cap is 105%, so 1.5% of the project sum in addition from the state, because the state going forward will save a lot of money because many more refugees are in the labor market. On the right-hand side, you see the payout for the investor, which is a little bit, steeper or wider. As I said, they can lose up to, it's 4.9%. They can make a profit of up to 5%, we call it interest rate, and they get the principal back. we wanted to be this to be more aggressive. We wanted it to be 15 plus, 15 minus, but the left-wing governor of the canton of Bern was very much afraid that there would be in the press maybe an article, you know, private investors earning 15% on the back of immigrants. I think he didn't understand the idea of it. Nevertheless, at the end, in Switzerland, also in Italy, it's all a compromise. If you want to implement such a pilot, you have to compromise. So we really narrowed this down and we made it very conservative, but it's not because investors were afraid, it's because the government was afraid to have bad press. Some more challenges, and it has been very challenging. One good thing is that the idea was started by entrepreneurs in our canton, entrepreneurs who said, okay, where are problems that we can try to help to solve, and we had the state with this problem of refugees. So it was really a public-private partnership between entrepreneurs who then also offered jobs to those refugees. That was a very, very positive thing. You see some of the obstacles we faced. Very, very no benchmark data. So except for this unemployment rate, but that's usually the biggest issue, that you lack data, or you have a scarcity of data. Then, as I just said, the equity model with more aggressive profit and loss was not well perceived. And I said that already, target success rate for social institutions, that was perceived as, you know, introducing capitalism into the social world. Yeah, I have a very different perspective on that. And I'm not just a tough capitalist, I'm originally a theologian. So ethics and the business world is very key to me. I believe that innovation can help, and innovation from the private sector can help solve social issues. You don't do it in a naive way, you need the state. I think that's very clear in Italy, in Switzerland, in continental Europe. It's not a private sector against the state, you need to do it together. But, and that's the last point here, you need to make compromises. So the level of bonuses and maluses, as I just said, was very low compared to our expectations. Now, I think the very inspiring part of this is we do have results, because we just, as I said, or try to say in Italian, we just finished the project. Here you have some figures. I assume they are comparable to challenges you face in Italy. You see a selection, it's a subset. We had 240 people in the program. I think 205 running through the whole program. And remember, the minimum was 120. So that was interesting to see that Caritas, because they had some incentives, that's my assumption, they were able to work with many more immigrants than they had, or the state had estimated before. It means they used less money per immigrant to work on this labor integration project. You see the both top graphs, you see that employability correlates with language skills. You see on the upper left, the group medium employability. You see the level of language in German, that is, they had, and you see on the right side, high employability. Basically, you see that the levels of language are higher. This is a very important learning, that whatever approach you take, you need language skills to integrate people into the labor market. Bottom left, you see which countries immigrants are from in Switzerland or in Bern. A large proportion currently comes from Eritrea, then Syria, with a lot of very, very qualified people. Let me again be a little bit critical towards the labor union, trade unions. and the political left. Many Syrians would have qualifications to work here as doctors, as engineers, but they are not allowed in because of limitations or of barriers. Afghanistan, Somalia, Iran, Iraq, and others. So that's the distribution. And then on the right side, you see the gender gap, really. That was a huge issue. Caritas really tried to have more women in the programs. You see 82% are male. In some nationalities, this is a huge issue because it's not, you have more men arriving, number one, and in some cultures, this is a real issue to have women participation go up. Now, what you're probably curious the most is what was the labor integration success? And here you see the blue graph represents the results against the benchmark from March 16 to September 20. And you see that we ended with 120 or 20% above benchmark, which translates, because of this very conservative mechanism, into 3.13% return for investors. So they will get the 100 they invested in back, and they will have a 3.13% interest for 5 years. Believe me, in Swiss franc, because we have negative interest rates, this is quite a nice return, commercially speaking. This is quite successful. Let me check. These are challenges. Where are we at the moment in the program? Well, the external evaluation entity is writing a report. We will release all data. There's a law in Switzerland that obliges the canton to release all data probably in January, February. There will be a huge interest. We see this now to research on that. And what we have in Switzerland, I think maybe it's comparable to Italy. We have a strong federalistic structure. So if the canton of Berna, which is usually very conservative, is innovative here, we will have other cantons such as Zurich or Basel maybe wanting to do something in that direction as well. So that's another statement from my side coming from the private sector. I believe competition or federalism is not just bad. I think it can trigger innovation that is good for social outcomes. Let me near the end of my presentation. Here you see some of the learnings. How is the SIB perceived from the various partners that have been involved here? The social institution, in this case Caritas, politics, government, and the private sector. So to do a public-private partnership, most actors find that positive. The private sector is probably agnostic about that, is open to invest if it's an interesting structure, is probably neutral. Then an investment, if you structure or if you answer to social challenges with an investment with possible gains and losses, the social institution at best is agnostic, is neutral. Some are very negative. Politics, as I said, are negative. They think that's dangerous. The government, it depends. We had a former banker working in the finance department of the canton. He thought that's very interesting. The private sector is more positive towards that issue. Trial and error. I think that's our history. That's the history of the examples Charles shared. We tried this out. To be very direct, I think a huge disadvantage of social impact bonds, again, is they're complex. They're too small usually. But I like the trial and error principle. You see here the various stakeholders. In our case, which really surprised us, the government was very open because they said we have a problem with refugees. We are open to searching for innovative solutions. And now the last point is interesting. if there are gaps in the social security system, this might be more the issue in the US, where you have less of a developed welfare state. Even in Switzerland, as I just showed, in Italy, you have gaps. Should they be closed, or should they be addressed by social impact bonds? In our case, the government was most skeptical to that, because they said we can do it better. So, you know, in government, you have many people who would like to keep the status quo. Private investors are more interested in that, and social institutions are more innovative. But the government usually thinks we have no gaps, we have everything under control. So that's an obstacle you have to overcome if you want to introduce such schemes. I think I'm almost done. Yeah, the key issue is that the scalability, that these models, also our pilot, you saw it is small. Even the ones Charles shared from the US, you know, Goldman Sachs being such a huge company, 8, 9, 10 million, it's nothing. In our case, 2.7 million Swiss franc. This is not addressed yet, how to scale this up and make it very cost efficient. I can end with the following statement, because I heard this from Charles mentioning some of the criticism. How much did Invetos take out of this, as we are the intermediary who brought together private investors and the state? Well, we didn't take anything out of it. We are a fairly successful company in our core business, and I want to make the statement, there are actors in the private sector who like innovation for the sake of innovation. So we thought we have to do this. For us, you can say it's a marketing gain, because our investors, as you have seen from the results, they will not lose money. They will make some returns, so they will like us for that. But this was all pro bono work by us, and otherwise we wouldn't have managed that, because it took 3 or 4 years of lobbying with the public sector. And I just want to make the statements. There are even bankers out here or out there who don't always need to take out something in order to drive innovation, but who might have other motives, such as a desire for innovative solutions to social issues. I think I'll end here. Over to you, Yara.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to hear from students if there are any questions. Otherwise, I have some. But first of all, I would like to hear if students have some issues. As I said before, Lucas also understands a bit of Italian. So you either make the question in Italian, I can translate it, or maybe Lucas also understand it. So I'll leave the floor to you, students, if you have any questions, or I'll break the ice, so to say, by asking some questions to Lucas. Are there any? So I'll break the ice first, I think. What I have many questions, to be fair. Some of them are so to say, just quick questions. The first one is, I was wondering whether the Caritas workers were volunteers or not, because one of the issues that I have always saw with these social impact bond structure is to understand whether they are less expensive than the state because they use volunteers, or they can actually manage to be more effective or more efficient than the states. So this is the first question to you, and then I have others.
The answer is simple. They are all paid. The Canton of Bern, as I said, has outsourced some of the social services to NGOs. Caritas is one of them. So the 2.7 million that were put into the project, that was mainly labor costs of the Caritas. They are called job coaches, who worked with those refugees and tried, and I forgot to, or I didn't elaborate on this, the concept applied here was supported employment. So Caritas tried to, based on the skills of those people, to integrate them, to call companies basically to find jobs or internships for them. And they were paid for this work. This was the main cost of the project, labor cost.
Okay, thank you. This is very important because we instead have other experiences. For instance, Duo for a Job in Belgium. You might have, you know, probably that experience. And in that case, they are volunteers. So I thought that also part of the cost that they could save was also because of that. The second question is, you said that the state, the canton decided to pay for the evaluation because otherwise the whole process would have been too expensive, I'm assuming. So I was wondering, what is the saving aspect for the canton? Was it actually just to try something new, or they managed to also to save some money out of that?
Well, thankfully, because the project has been going well, the canton will save, I can't quantify it yet, but the canton will save a huge amount of money because many people that would have otherwise stayed in social welfare are now in the labor market. So I can't quantify it yet, but this is a huge impact. So although the state has to pay back the project money, don't forget that those people have been on social welfare until now and are not anymore. So the state was more than willing to invest some additional money into research because they said, and this is very, very long-term thinking, which I appreciated, they said, if we do that, we also want to work on having better data, having better evaluation, and making sure that, let's say, Vetos or Caritas cannot manipulate. So yes, it was an additional investment from their side because they said, we want to use all the data that we will derive out of this pilot project for further possible such projects. And of course, this was very, very lucky that they did that. And I don't know how the context would be in Italy. One alternative, if the state would not be willing to pay for that, I think we would have found a foundation. In Italy, I remember once being in Torino presenting this, you have these huge banking foundations where I know they are sometimes willing to pay research, to finance research for social development.
Okay, last question, and then I leave the floor to the students. Who were the investors? Were there any citizens or single private investors, or were they all companies? I don't know, medium-sized company or huge companies?
They were private investors, some of them, or fairly wealthy private investors who said, I want to put my money into something social where I might gain something or lose something. As you have seen, the returns are very low. So they didn't do this for commercial reasons. They were simply interested in impact investing. And the other group was charitable foundations, as you have them in Italy, the banking foundations. Large, one of them very large, who said, we love this. This is really maybe close to our foundation mission. It's an investment for us. It's not a donation. And you know, those foundations, not pension funds, charitable foundations, they think long-term and they can take some risks.
Okay. Do the students want to jump in for questions? Also, I would like to hear from students, what are their impressions? Do they like, so to say, these kind of investments? Do they think that we can have the risk of the privatization of welfare, as we have mentioned with Charles, but also last time in the previous lessons? So do you have insights on the issue? I know that it is in English, so it might be a bit harder, but as I said, you can also talk in Italian, and
forse in un italiano semplice.
Yeah, exactly. Are there
anyone around?
Anyone?
Hi.
Very well.
I wanted to ask if you said that all the actors in this project were satisfied and it was a successful project. So I wanted to ask if the government especially is willing to invest in other similar project or not.
It's a question that leads a little bit to a tragedy, and I believe you can understand that from an Italian background. When we started this, the government in Bern was left-wing. During the project, we had elections. Now we have a right-wing guy managing the social department. So what he likes is cost savings, and he sees the cost savings here. But as you can imagine, he wants to be re-elected in 2 years. So I'm not very sure yet how open he will be to innovation that will take more time to have an impact. So I doubt that the government of Bern, because it has changed substantially, will do more projects. Because they simply have pretty brutally now scaled back on costs. But my hope is, because of this federal structure in Switzerland, it would be maybe like if Alto Adige had something very innovative, maybe Lombardia would want it as well. So my hope would be that Zurigo or Basilea, they might want to do something.
Thank you.
And also maybe the topic would not be for the right wing might be not the best, because the integration of refugees is not obviously some hot topic for the right wing.
Exactly.
Are there any other questions?
Good evening. I wanted to ask Lucas, being Caritas a non-profit organization, in case the project wouldn't have gone well, would have Caritas supported the malus, the loss of money by itself, or someone would have integrated or helped the organization? And also another question, do you think if one day you will be able to, or someone will be able to expand this project to a higher scale and maybe also apply it to the Switzerland society, like non-immigrants people, but the normal unemployed, that also Caritas will help in that situation or not?
Your first question, and this has been revolutionary in Switzerland. If this project would have gone wrong in terms of outcomes, Caritas would have had to pay back from their own pockets. That was in the contract. So, but keep in mind, 1.5% of the 2.7 million, it's 35 to 40,000 francs, which is a lot of money, but Caritas is large in Switzerland, but they wouldn't have had some donor giving that money to them. They would have had to pay it back. And for them, it was they wanted to be to be nominated for this project, but they told us, and this is new for us, that we have some risk or some of the outcome tied to money. The second question you asked, could we scale this up? We would love to scale this up with, and you could, you could take any topic. The issue is you need a clearly defined group, and you need to be able to benchmark it. There was another group that was discussed, teenage moms. You have in Switzerland, you have this phenomena that if women become mothers very early, they are on social welfare, and the probability that their kids will be on social welfare again is very high. So there was a project of helping them to get jobs while their kids were provided for. You could take any issue where you can clearly segregate the target population. Yes, we would love to expand it in the labor market. One thing, and I don't want to bash on labor unions, but I just have to say it, we had to stop. Many of the companies said, we will take 1 or 2 guys from Syria, from Eritrea, but before we give them a permanent contract, we want to give them an internship. And the labor unions stopped that because they thought it was the salaries were lower than regular workers received. So they thought it was salary dumping. For this reason, the very successful instrument of internships had to be abandoned. So as in Italy, probably, we do face resistance from groups who, let me try to be very fair, who are not interested in innovation, or maybe would argue it's, you know, it's the private sector taking everything away.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, the insiders topic also for Charles is something very known, because one of the critics that are addressed against trade unions is actually the fact that they tend to protect people who have already a job, which is actually if you think about it, natural, because the people who join the union are usually people who already have a job, most of the cases, not every case. But therefore, trade unions are likely to protect more their people who their membership, rather than people who are not in membership. So this is a huge topic also for trade unionists and for labor lawyers, that in this case you see the impact, because they did not want someone else to enter the market, the labor law market, because of dumping, because they thought these could lead to a lower jobs or lower wages for other workers. So are there any questions, or want Charles to join into the discussion? I haven't heard from any of the students whether you think, what your impression on these tools are. Because I've heard many very interesting questions, but I haven't heard your opinion. Do you think these instruments are, so to say, good or bad? What do you think it's an innovative way to think about the solutions of labor law problems, or do you see the risk of the privatization of the market? Are there any people who have an idea on that? It's just opinions, it's not right and wrong, as we have seen from Charles and from Lucas. We have different opinions from politicians, from citizens, from trade unionists. So there's not right or wrong, just more of way to see problems and solutions. New ones. Everyone is scared.
That's a tough one, Chiara.
Do you want to jump in, Charles, to say something about the outsider-insider issue problem from the trade union's point of view, or?
Yeah, I think Lucas made a really excellent point about that. And there was a recent issue, I mean, relatively recently, with health insurance. You know, again, the US was far behind Europe in that. And mostly we just had private health insurance connected to work, right? And if you were in a labor union, you had very good insurance. You know, it was called, you know, Cadillacs aren't so popular anymore, but, you know, the deluxe plan if you were a union member. And then the question, when Barack Obama wanted to bring in, you know, more universal health insurance, what should the unions do? Because if everyone gets insurance, then the unions are a little bit less unique, right? And in fact, they were going to tax the union plans, healthcare plans higher to pay for insurance for everybody. And that caught the unions in a difficult position because if you're a union member, you have deluxe health insurance. So what did the unions do? Do you support national health insurance? And that makes the unions a little bit less unique. And that caught them in a bad position. And just like Lucas was talking about with the Syrian or the internships, right? Yeah, technically in a micro level, the union was defending the wage levels, right? Or whatever collective agreement might have been there. But I think in a broader level, they're probably missing something. Probably looking for the longer term, the unions need to I think, not narrowly protect only the members' interests, but look at society as well. And I think that will help them. I think that will help them in the future. So I think that was an excellent point that Lucas made. That I did mention, even though I'm from a union perspective, sometimes the interests are not aligned. And that's one of the downsides in leaving impact investing only to unions or as a primary vehicle. The other just point I wanted to make with Lucas's presentation about, the NGO Caritas having some risk. I thought that was really interesting and very innovative because in the literature in the US, I mentioned critiques from the left about, social impact bonds. The critique from the right had been the NGOs, they don't have any risk. It's all on the investor to one degree or another. And I thought that was quite innovative from Lucas and his firm to come up with that.
Actually, also in other experiences, I think with the students, we have seen some experience from the Netherlands, and also in that occasion, the service provider was somehow involved, not in the way Lucas thought, that means gaining or losing something, but the idea in that case was that the service provider had to be also an investor. So they did not only have to be the provider of the service, but also to put some money in that. So being these experiences coming from the praxis, everyone has made his own way to solve the issues that have been arised. And one of the issues is actually that the service provider is paid because of the service and not because of the result. So some ways to involve them more has been these two, I would say, the one that Lucas came up with, and also to make them investors. Okay, are there any questions, or do we go to the conclusions? This was the last lesson of the clinic. Of the project, as you know, is the European project, so it's a bit different from the other clinics. I will put the registration on the Moodle and also the slides. I already put these Lucas slides on the platform, and you will find also Charles' slide on that. And so I thank everyone. I thank Charles, I thank Lucas, and I thank all the students for the interesting questions, and see you at the exam. Actually, I will see you at the exam to the students, and hope to see you soon, Charles and Lucas. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.